Russia, Vladimir Putin. Josh Weil, who we're going to bring up right now, has lived and studied in Russia. And we might need to send him over there to do some reconnaissance work for us. Josh Weil, 2015 fiction winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for The Great Glass Sea, is the author of the novella collection The New Valley. Both works were New York Times Editor's Choices, a Fulbright Fellow and National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. He has been awarded the American Academy of Arts and Letters Sue Kaufman Prize, the Grub Street National Book Prize, the Library of Virginia Literary Award, and the Pushcart Prize. He lives in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. Ladies and gentlemen, Josh Weil.
Thank you, Will. It is so good to be back here with you all. I needed this. I think a lot of people here did. I think we all do every year, but maybe especially this year. Last year, I spoke of the way this peace and literature-loving community's support stirred my determination to try to make the next thing that I wrote something meaningful, worthy of such an embrace. So first I want to report back, and I haven't written it. But I am trying, and you have bolstered me along the way. You've helped me make braver choices in what I'm trying to do now. You all, writers, readers, people who care so deeply about the world, you continue to inspire me, as does this year's winner of the award for fiction. The Sympathizer is an eye-opening, thought-provoking novel told as a confession by a communist double agent embedded in the South Vietnamese army during what America calls the Vietnam War, and then embedded in America itself in the years after. Viet Thanh Nguyen writes in carefully crafted prose about complex ideas with such narrative daring. Viet, I don't know where you are, but there were times when I found myself exclaiming, "Oh man, he's gonna do that?" And he writes with such sheer verve that this novel would be compelling even if it wasn't powered by a hell of a plot. Plus it's funny and shocking and sad. It is a brilliant book. You don't need me to tell you that. You've seen the gold on the cover, the long list of accolades. By the way, I just want to say it's kind of crazy to stand here as one of 5 fiction writers speaking tonight and realize that the fact that I've not won the Pulitzer Prize places me in the minority. Is quite a lineup. So when I said that Viet's novel inspires me, I could as well have said it humbles me. After all, the two so often go together for all the reasons I've mentioned, but none so much as for what it did to me. This book complicated my thinking about an entire era in our country's history. It both challenges the story told largely by Americans to Americans about the American experience of the Vietnam War, and it exposes us to the Vietnamese experience of what they call the American War. In part, this is accomplished through Nguyen's choice of a narrator, a half-Vietnamese, half-French, self-described man of 2 minds, who tells us he is, quote, able to see any issue from both sides. In part, it's because he does his seeing mostly after the fall of Saigon, from within an immigrant community of Vietnamese Americans. This allows Nguyen to write about America as much as Vietnam, to examine this country's character as sharply as any book I've recently read. We, the narrator says, were the greatest anthropologists ever of the American people. The statement is in the past, and the story is set in the 70s, but its greatest gift to us, American readers, the sight of ourselves through the eyes of those who see us as the other, is as relevant right now as ever. And it's the fact that this book bears witness to a 40-year-old war through a Vietnamese view of Americans and an American view of Vietnamese and an immigrant's view of both in a way that winds up giving us all a greater understanding of the world we live in now It's that struck me most powerfully. Maybe it's the timeliness of the questions that the narrator faces near the end. What do those who struggle against power do when they seize power? What does the revolutionary do when the revolution triumphs? Important questions for us now too, no? As important as the idea of this novel's emotional core, the imperative of sympathy, hard and hazardous as it is for others. Speaking of his enemies, the narrator at one point tells us, "I confess that after having spent almost my whole life in their company, I cannot help but sympathize with them." This, that he calls a weakness, is of course his greatest strength, and one of this remarkable book's greatest strengths, and one of the most urgent and important ways in which we in this great country must be strong now, to sympathize with each other. If we can learn to see both sides, to be men and women, quote, of two minds, then perhaps this book can help to make us, I mean this nation, but also any nation, whole. And what could be more deserving of this prize than that? Please welcome this year's winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction, Viet Thanh Nguyen.
I just want to preface this by saying I've spent a lot of time over the last few days in the company of writers, editors, publishers, people in the literary world. Before I was here, I was in New York City for another prize ceremony. I didn't win that one, by the way. But that was okay, because I knew I was coming here, I was going to definitely get this prize, so everything was cool. And it's like going to church for those of us who are atheists, like myself. You know, we're in this community of people who share in the love and the joy of words and stories and images and poems and narratives, and we affirm for ourselves the possibilities of what it is that literature can do. So thank you to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for this award. Thank you to Christine Schutt and Alexander Chi for their work in judging, and to Sharon Rabb for her vision and energy. I'm honored to be in the company of Susan Southard, James Hanahan, Kennedy O'Day, who's not here today, but in spirit, Jessica Posner, and Marilyn Robinson. Our collective works speak to the desire of writers to confront war, conflict, trauma, inequality, and misunderstanding, and to use the power of language and storytelling to offer hope. But receiving this award is something of an irony, for in writing The Sympathizer, I wasn't thinking about peace. I was thinking about war. Specifically the war that made me, and war in general. I wanted to portray the perspectives of each side in the war, which some call the Vietnam War and others call the American War. Like all wars, this one came dressed in the finest rhetoric. A war fought for abstract words like freedom, independence, democracy, unification. All sides use these kinds of words, which only goes to show that Hegel was correct. Tragedy is the conflict of right versus right, not right versus wrong. This is why I created a narrator whose one talent, he tells us immediately, is to see any issue from both sides. It's a rare talent, since it's more comforting for many of us to see conflicts from only one side, which makes them easier to comprehend. Seeing in this fashion, it's tempting to remember our virtues and forget our vices, and to do the exact reverse for our enemies, whom we demonize. This is a viewpoint that leads us to war and makes reconciliation difficult. My narrator understands that no side has a monopoly on virtue or vice. Regardless of who started his war, each side committed atrocities that contradicted the high-flown rhetoric of their leaders, which so many followers want to believe, since it reassures them of their own goodness. It's not reassuring to see any issue from more than one side, since such a view makes it more difficult for the sympathetic person to be certain. And certainty is required for war and for politics. To be uncertain and to sympathize with the other side, if expressed in public, is not simply to express a personal doubt. Such uncertainty or sympathy may mark the doubting person as a traitor to her or his own side. This is how my narrator, a revolutionary, nevertheless ends up in a communist re-education camp run by his own comrades. He has sympathized too much with the other side. It's the fear of being seen as a traitor that is also a roadblock to peace, for it's more comforting to follow our party and to listen only to the like-minded. A commitment to peace is hence much more difficult than a commitment to war. All societies make it easy to commit to war. To commit to peace means that one has experienced doubt regarding the things held dear by most of one's fellow citizens: the flag, the anthem, the rhetoric, the slogan. My narrator experiences revolutionary certainty and the doubt that comes from sympathizing with his enemies, but he never is able to articulate a commitment to peace. This is partly because there is no genre of the peace story for him to imagine himself in, at least nothing on the scale of the war story. And if there is a peace story, it usually ends in the protagonist's martyrdom, or it takes too long to tell, since peace movements take forever to reach fruition, if they ever do. Wars, in contrast, last only a few years, or so we think. One of the things that became apparent to me in writing about my war was that it never ended. Simply because a ceasefire was declared does not mean that a war is over. Retributions happen. Traumas continue. Just as importantly, one war is often the consequence of a previous war and foreshadows a future war. My project was not only about my war, but about how that war fit into a 1,000-year history of war for the Vietnamese, who hated the Chinese and still do. As for Americans, their Vietnam War was only one part of a larger campaign to move west, seize the Pacific, and dominate Asia, beginning with Indian conquest and continuing through the Mexican-American War, the Philippine-American War of 1898, World War II, the Korean War, and extending today into the Middle East, which can also be understood as a part of Asia or the Orient. Seen in this way, war is a condition, not an event. War is perpetual, not singular. War is a part of our everyday lives, not an exceptional occurrence. Thinking of war as perpetual, as depressing as it sounds, is at the same time hopeful, in the sense that it more realistically imagines how deeply embedded war is in our society. And if war is perpetual, then the movement for peace must be perpetual as well. Knowing that peace takes a long time might prevent our hopes from being dashed when peace is not achieved in years or decades or even centuries. Military and political strategists plot with the long view in mind, and so must we who are committed to peace. As a realist, I don't believe in peace. As an idealist, I have to believe in peace. We live in bloody and fearful times, but I think back to how only a few millennia before, our human imagination was once limited to the tribe. Realism meant seeing the world only as far as the horizon. Now we can see further, and our imagination extends far beyond the horizon. Perhaps writers have something to do with that expansion of the imagination, which has occurred while we as a species have collectively groped towards the end of war, conflict, violence, and abuse. The role of writers in these half-blind efforts is twofold. We can portray the worst of what human beings do to each other, and in so doing, we can remind our readers and ourselves that inhumanity is a fundamental part of humanity. Remembering only our humanity will not get us to peace, because it allows us to forget our capacity for brutality. If we forget that capacity, we will repeat that brutality. In the face of that cruel truth, we can also imagine the best that humanity is capable of, and in that way provide a vision of how to overcome the momentum of past conflicts and inherited bitterness. In this task, writers and readers are helped by the fact that literature is a sanctuary. No book has ever refused a reader. Great literature cannot exist if it is based on hate, fear, division, exclusion, scapegoating, or the worship of injustice and power. Writers cannot write if they're incapable of empathy, of imagining what it is that an other feels, thinks, and sees. Through identifying with characters and people who are nothing like us, through destroying the walls between ourselves and others that it is so easy to hide behind, we who love words learn to love others. This is how literature inherently stands for peace, which should encourage all of us who are writers and readers to rise to the challenge of fighting to determine whose story will define our America. Rather than building walls, we should be opening hearts. And rather than making America great again, we should help America love again. Thank you.